Across the spiral arm of the Andromeda sector, where civilizations rise and fall with the regularity of cosmic hiccups, stood the Nexus Crystalline, a diplomatic station so magnificent that entire species had bankrupted themselves just building shuttles worthy of approaching it. The structure hung in space like a frozen scream of architectural ambition, its faceted surfaces reflecting the light of 3 suns while somehow managing to look perpetually judgmental about the whole affair. Inside its vast central chamber, representatives from 47 different species had gathered for what historians would later describe as either the most important diplomatic summit in galactic history or the most expensive comedy show ever staged, depending on one's perspective regarding the inherent absurdity of interstellar politics. The chamber itself defied several laws of physics and at least 2 principles of good taste, with gravity fields arranged so that delegates could stand on walls, ceilings, or floating platforms according to their species' preferences for dramatic positioning. The assembled beings represented the full spectrum of evolutionary creativity. The Zephyrins hung from crystalline perches like judgmental bats with superiority complexes, their translucent wings catching light in patterns that somehow conveyed condescension. The Molten Collective bubbled in specialized containment suits, their lava-based forms creating an atmosphere of barely controlled volcanic irritation. Rock-like sedimentarians stood in perfect geometric formations, having spent the last 3 centuries perfecting their ability to look monumentally bored while technically paying attention. Each species had perfected their own particular method of displaying submission to the hegemony, and watching them practice was like observing a museum of creative groveling. The Zephyrians performed aerial ballet sequences that spelled out apologies in ancient hegemonic script. The Molten Collective created elaborate lava sculptures depicting their unworthiness. The sedimentarians simply became slightly more rectangular, which in their culture represented the absolute pinnacle of respectful deference. At the center of this magnificent display of synchronized subservience sat the hegemony's representative, a being so imposing that entire military academies taught courses on his intimidation techniques. Standing 12 feet tall with chitin plating that absorbed light like a walking event horizon, he possessed 4 arms specifically evolved for dramatic gesturing and eyes that glowed with the kind of authority that came from never having been told no by anyone with sufficient life insurance. The air thrummed with tension and the faint ozone scent of barely contained violence, punctuated by the nervous chittering of species who had traveled light years just for the privilege of being terrified in person. Diplomatic protocols demanded absolute submission or face immediate vaporization, a policy that had kept the galactic peace for millennia, assuming one defined peace as the absence of anyone brave enough to object to anything. Then the human arrived. She entered through the main portal with all the ceremony of someone walking into a grocery store, wearing what appeared to be a simple dark suit that somehow managed to look both professional and completely unconcerned with the cosmic significance of the moment. Her hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and she carried a small leather briefcase that looked like it had seen more diplomatic crises than most galactic empires. The chamber fell silent, with the kind of profound quiet usually reserved for funeral parlors and tax audits. 47 species turned their various sensory organs toward this newcomer who had committed the unprecedented act of entering without immediately prostrating herself, performing ritual dances, or at minimum apologizing for existing. She walked across the polished crystal floor with the unhurried gait of someone who had never encountered a situation that couldn't be improved with proper planning and reasonable conversation. Her shoes clicked against the crystalline surface with a steady rhythm that somehow sounded more confident than the various roars, chants, and ceremonial wailing that typically filled the space. The human paused in the center of the chamber, looked around at the assembled multitude of galactic civilization with the air of someone taking inventory, and then did something that would be discussed in xenopsychology courses for the next 1,000 years. She smiled. It was not a diplomatic smile, carefully calculated to convey the precise mixture of respect and appeasement that interstellar protocol demanded. It was not the nervous grimace of someone desperately trying to avoid becoming a cautionary tale. It was the genuine, slightly tired smile of a professional who dealt with difficult situations for a living and had long since learned that most problems were significantly less complicated than the people creating them preferred to believe. The hegemony representative rose from his throne with a deliberate menace of an avalanche, accepting a personal invitation to demonstrate gravity. His 4 arms spread wide in a gesture that had preceded the obliteration of entire star systems, and his voice echoed through the chamber with the authority of someone accustomed to having his words carved into monuments. "Kneel before the might of the hegemony," he declared, each syllable resonating with harmonic frequencies designed to trigger submission responses in most known species. "Bow your head in acknowledgement of your inferior status, or face the consequences that have befallen every fool who dared stand upright in our presence." The assembled delegates held their breath, or whatever respiratory function their species had evolved for dramatic pauses. This was the moment that defined civilizations, the cosmic crossroads where beings either submitted to the established order or became object lessons in the importance of reading the room. The human looked up at the towering figure, considered his ultimatum with the thoughtful expression of someone reviewing a restaurant menu, and then sat down cross-legged on the crystal floor. "That's quite an impressive speech," she said conversationally, settling into a comfortable position with the practiced ease of someone who had spent considerable time in meditation classes. "But before we get into all the bowing and dying business, would it be possible to get some tea? I've been traveling for 3 days, and I find these sorts of negotiations go much better when everyone's properly caffeinated." The silence that followed could have been bottled and sold as a premium-grade vacuum. 47 different species experienced simultaneous cognitive dissonance as their understanding of how diplomatic encounters functioned underwent rapid and traumatic revision. The Zephyrian's wings froze mid-flutter. The molten collective's lava forms stopped bubbling entirely, creating the geological equivalent of a record scratch. Even the sedimentarians managed to look surprised, which for beings made of rock required considerable effort. The hegemony representative stood with his arms still spread in threatening display, but his expression had shifted from cosmic menace to the bewildered look of someone whose carefully rehearsed intimidation routine had been derailed by a question about beverage service. His glowing eyes dimmed slightly as his brain attempted to process a response that existed completely outside the established parameters of galactic diplomacy. In the observation galleries, minor functionaries from various species began furiously consulting their diplomatic handbooks, searching for precedents that simply didn't exist. The crystalline archivists, whose entire civilization was built around maintaining perfect records of everything that had ever happened, began experiencing what could only be described as bureaucratic panic attacks, as they realized they were witnessing something genuinely unprecedented. "Tea?" the hegemony representative repeated, his voice lacking its previous cosmic authority and sounding more like someone who had walked into the wrong conversation. "You dare sit in our presence and request refreshments?" The human adjusted her position slightly, demonstrating the kind of casual comfort that suggested she had no intention of moving anytime soon. "Well, yes. It's been a long journey, and I find that complex negotiations require proper hydration. Green tea would be lovely, though I'm flexible if you only have herbal varieties. Earl Grey in a pinch, though I do hope you haven't made the same mistake as the Centaurian Federation and added artificial bergamot flavoring." The mention of the Centurion Federation's tea diplomatic failures sent ripples of nervous energy through the assembled delegates. The Federation's attempt to serve synthetic Earl Grey to a Terran trade delegation had resulted in a 2-decade trade embargo, and 3 strongly worded letters that were still taught in diplomatic schools as examples of how refreshment protocols could destabilize entire sectors. "You mock our authority," the hegemony representative declared, though his voice carried less conviction than before. The human's complete lack of intimidation was proving more unsettling than actual defiance would have been. Beings who cowered or raged were predictable. Beings who made reasonable requests for hot beverages while sitting comfortably on the floor were clearly operating from an entirely different playbook. "Not at all," the human replied with the patient tone of someone explaining something obvious to a particularly slow student. "I'm simply prioritizing comfort and proper meeting etiquette. In my experience, the best diplomatic solutions emerge when all parties are relaxed and thinking clearly. It's rather difficult to think clearly when you're dehydrated, and even more difficult when you're standing in uncomfortable positions for extended periods." She gestured around the chamber with a casual air of someone offering helpful observations. "I noticed that most of your delegates have been standing in what appear to be rather stressful positions. The Zephyrians must be getting wing cramps from all that hovering, and I can't imagine those containment suits are comfortable for extended wear. Has anyone ever considered that you might reach better agreements if everyone could sit down and relax a bit?" The suggestion rippled through the assembly like a philosophical virus. Several delegates glanced around nervously, suddenly aware of their own physical discomfort. A few of the sedimentarians shifted their weight imperceptibly, and one of the molten collective representatives made a sound that might have been agreement, or might have been the lava equivalent of a thoughtful hum. The hegemony representative found himself in the unprecedented position of having his entire worldview challenged by furniture preferences. For millennia, the standing submission posture had been fundamental to maintaining proper hierarchical relationships. The idea that beings might negotiate better while comfortable was so revolutionary it bordered on the heretical. "Sterling," he barked, his voice cracking slightly as he attempted to regain control of the situation. "Bring refreshments for the Terran delegate." The command echoed through the chamber's communication systems, causing considerable confusion among the support staff, who had never been asked to provide hospitality services during what were typically brief encounters ending in either submission or vaporization. Somewhere in the station's service levels, beings scrambled to locate anything that might approximate tea, while frantically consulting databases on human beverage preferences. Meanwhile, the human had begun examining her fingernails with the patient air of someone accustomed to waiting for bureaucratic processes to catch up with common sense. Her casual demeanor was having an increasingly hypnotic effect on the assembled delegates, many of whom were beginning to question why they had been standing at attention when sitting was clearly an option. "While we're waiting," she continued conversationally, "perhaps you could explain the territorial dispute that's brought everyone here today. I've read the preliminary reports, of course, but I find that these situations often have nuances that don't come through in official documentation." The request was so reasonable, delivered in such a matter-of-fact tone, that the hegemony representative found himself actually considering a diplomatic discussion rather than proceeding directly to threats and ultimatums. The realization that he was thinking about negotiation rather than domination hit him with the force of a small moon, causing his imposing posture to waver slightly. The arrival of the refreshment services created what historians would later describe as the first recorded instance of interstellar hospitality panic. A parade of nervous servants bearing various vessels of steaming liquids entered the chamber with the uncertain gait of beings who had never before been asked to provide customer service during a diplomatic crisis. The lead servant, a multi-limbed being whose species had evolved specifically for carrying things efficiently, approached the human with an expression of profound bewilderment. "We have brought various heated beverages," the servant announced, its voice containing the careful precision of someone reading from hastily written cue cards. "The preparation methods may not align with Terran preferences, as our kitchen staff has no experience with your species' consumption requirements." The human smiled with genuine appreciation, the kind of expression that somehow made everyone in the vicinity feel slightly better about existence. "That's very thoughtful of you. I'm sure whatever you've prepared will be fine." She accepted a crystalline cup containing a liquid that was approximately the right color for tea, though it steamed with faint purple vapors and smelled like a forest fire in a spice shop. After taking a careful sip, she nodded approvingly, demonstrating either remarkable diplomatic tact or an iron constitution. "Interesting flavor profile," she observed, settling back into her comfortable position. "There's a definite floral note, with hints of what I can only describe as controlled combustion. Very unique. What type of leaves did you use?" The servant consulted its notes nervously. The kitchen staff utilized dried Zephyrian wing membrane fragments, as they were the closest available organic material that could be steeped in heated liquid. Rather than expressing the horror that most beings would feel upon learning they were drinking wing membrane tea, the human simply nodded thoughtfully. "Ah, that explains the mineral undertones. Quite creative, really. You might consider adding a small amount of sweetening agent to balance the natural astringency of the membrane tissue." This casual acceptance of their improvised beverage service had a profound effect on the assembled beings. Here was a creature so unflappable that she could critique the flavor profile of wing membrane tea without missing a beat, treating their desperate hospitality attempts with the same serious consideration that most species reserved for peace treaties. The hegemony representative watched this exchange with growing unease. His entire authority structure depended on beings being too intimidated to notice that his dramatic pronouncements were largely theatrical. The human's cheerful pragmatism was exposing the elaborate pageantry of galactic diplomacy as essentially an expensive performance designed to avoid actually solving problems. "You still have not acknowledged our supremacy," he declared, though his voice lacked its previous cosmic authority. Standing while she sat comfortably was beginning to feel less like a position of dominance and more like a tactical disadvantage. "Well, that's because I'm still not entirely clear on what acknowledging your supremacy would accomplish," the human replied reasonably, taking another sip of her wing membrane tea. "I mean, I understand that it's traditional, but tradition should serve some practical purpose, don't you think? What specific outcomes are we trying to achieve here?" The question hung in the air like an unexpected philosophical bomb. Around the chamber, delegates began exchanging glances as they realized that none of them had ever actually considered what the submission rituals were supposed to accomplish beyond maintaining the status quo. The Zephyrians' formation wavered as individual members began questioning why they were expending considerable energy on aerial choreography when they could simply state their positions clearly. One of the sedimentarian representatives made a sound like grinding gravel, which in their species indicated deep contemplation. The flesh creature raised a valid inquiry, it rumbled. What functional purpose does the submission ceremony serve, beyond perpetuating the submission ceremony? This observation triggered a cascade of philosophical uncertainty throughout the assembly. The molten collective began bubbling more vigorously as their hive mind processed the implications of ceremonial inefficiency. Several smaller species, who had spent considerable resources perfecting their submission displays, began calculating the cost-benefit ratio of their elaborate genuflection protocols. The human, apparently oblivious to the existential crisis she was precipitating, continued her gentle deconstruction of galactic political theater. For instance, this territorial dispute you're all here to resolve. From what I understand, 3 different species are claiming mining rights to the same asteroid cluster. Rather than having everyone stand around looking threatening while I demonstrate proper subservience, wouldn't it be more efficient to simply examine the relevant claim documentation and work out a mutually beneficial arrangement? She gestured with her teacup, somehow making the simple motion look like the most reasonable thing anyone had ever done. Perhaps we could establish a profit-sharing agreement or develop a rotation schedule for mining operations. These sorts of resource conflicts usually have fairly straightforward solutions once you get past all the posturing. The hegemony representative felt his carefully constructed reality beginning to crumble around him like a sandcastle in a tsunami of common sense. For centuries, his species had maintained their authority by making every interaction a test of dominance, ensuring that other beings were too busy being intimidated to notice that most interstellar conflicts could be resolved with basic project management skills. The authority structure must be maintained, he insisted, though he was beginning to sound like someone trying to convince himself as much as his audience. Without proper hierarchical relationships, chaos would consume the galaxy. The human looked genuinely puzzled by this assertion. But hierarchies can exist within collaborative frameworks, can't they? I mean, someone needs to moderate discussions and ensure that agreements are properly implemented. That's just good meeting management. It doesn't require anyone to grovel or risk vaporization. Several delegates made sounds of agreement, creating a murmur of consensus that had never before been heard in the chamber's long history of intimidation-based diplomacy. The radical concept that authority could be functional rather than theatrical was spreading through the assembly like a beneficial infection. The arrival of additional beverage service transformed the diplomatic crisis into something resembling an accidental tea party. Word had spread through the station's service levels that the Terran delegate had not only survived requesting refreshments, but had provided constructive feedback on their preparation methods. Kitchen staff from various species began arriving with increasingly creative interpretations of hot beverages, turning the formal chamber into an impromptu cultural exchange program. A nervous Zephyrian server approached with a cup containing what appeared to be liquid light, glowing softly with bioluminescent particles. "We have prepared an infusion of aurora moss," it announced, its translucent wings fluttering with anticipation. The preparation involved exposing the moss to 17 different frequencies of cosmic radiation while chanting traditional brewing songs. The human accepted the cup with the same gracious appreciation she had shown the wing membrane tea, though this new beverage was considerably more challenging to evaluate. The liquid seemed to shift colors as she held it, and tiny sparkles danced across the surface like microscopic firework. "Remarkable presentation," she observed after a cautious sip. "There's definitely an energetic quality to it, almost effervescent. The radiation treatment gives it a very distinctive molecular structure, though I'd suggest reducing the cosmic ray exposure time slightly. There's a faint, metallic aftertaste that suggests some atomic degradation in the moss fibers." The Zephyrian server practically glowed with pride at receiving constructive criticism from someone who treated their improvised beverage as a legitimate culinary effort rather than a desperate attempt to avoid species-wide embarrassment. Around the chamber, other beings began volunteering their own cultural refreshment contributions, eager to participate in what was rapidly becoming the galaxy's first collaborative diplomatic refreshment program. The hegemony representative watched this development with the growing horror of someone witnessing their entire worldview being systematically replaced by something significantly more pleasant. His subjects were no longer cowering in terrified submission, but instead engaging in enthusiastic discussions about brewing techniques and flavor profiles. The chamber's atmosphere had shifted from cosmic dread to something resembling a remarkably diverse dinner party. "This is not how galactic diplomacy functions," he declared, though his protest sounded increasingly hollow as more species began settling into comfortable positions around the chamber. Several sedimentarians had rearranged themselves into makeshift seating areas, while the Molten Collective had formed impromptu tables from their cooler members. "Well, it seems to be functioning quite well now," the human replied, gesturing around the chamber where genuine cross-species conversation was occurring for the first time in recorded history, "and we haven't even gotten to the actual territorial dispute yet. Once everyone's comfortable and properly refreshed, we should be able to sort out this mining rights situation fairly quickly." She pulled a small tablet from her briefcase and began reviewing documents with the brisk efficiency of someone who solved complicated problems for a living. "I've been looking at the asteroid cluster surveys, and it appears that the 3 contested regions have different mineral compositions. Rather than fighting over the same resources, each species could focus on the materials most suited to their technological needs." The simplicity of this observation struck the assembly like a revelation. The Molten Collective required high-temperature metals for their industrial processes, while the Zephyrians needed crystalline formations for their energy systems, and the third claimant species specialized in rare earth extraction. The asteroid cluster contained all 3 resource types in different sectors, making the entire territorial dispute essentially a case of poor coordination rather than genuine scarcity. "Furthermore," the human continued, consulting her notes while sipping her Aurora Moss tea, "establishing joint extraction operations would be significantly more cost-effective than maintaining separate mining infrastructures. You could share transportation costs, coordinate supply chains, and establish mutual defense agreements for the mining stations." The representatives from the 3 disputing species began exchanging glances as they realized that cooperation would actually improve their profit margins while reducing their operational risks. The concept was so fundamentally sensible that they wondered why none of their strategic planning committees had considered it during the previous decades of escalating tensions. The hegemony representative found himself in the unprecedented position of watching a territorial dispute resolve itself through practical resource management rather than dramatic ultimatums. His entire authority structure depended on maintaining conflicts that required his mediation, but the human was systematically eliminating the need for intimidation-based solutions. But what about the proper protocols?" he asked weakly, gesturing toward his throne with its built-in vaporization systems and ceremonial terror enhancement features. "The traditional structures that maintain galactic order?" The human looked up from her tablet with the patient expression of someone explaining basic concepts to a confused colleague. "Well, protocols should serve the people who use them, shouldn't they? If the current system isn't actually solving problems efficiently, then perhaps it's time to develop better protocols." She gestured around the chamber, where species were beginning to form working groups to discuss the practical implementation of their newfound collaborative approach. "Look how much more progress we're making now that everyone can think clearly. No one's stressed about being vaporized. No one's wasting energy on elaborate submission displays, and we're actually addressing the underlying issues." The logic was so indisputable that the hegemony representative found himself slowly, almost involuntarily, settling into a sitting position. The movement felt strange after millennia of looming dramatically over subordinates, but the practical benefits were immediately apparent. His back felt better, his dramatic arm spreading was no longer necessary, and he could actually focus on the conversation rather than maintaining his intimidating posture. "This is most irregular," he muttered, though he made no move to return to his standing position. "Change usually is," the human agreed cheerfully, offering him a cup of what appeared to be a hybrid beverage created by mixing several of the previous offerings. "But irregular doesn't necessarily mean wrong. Sometimes the most effective solutions are the ones that nobody thought to try before." As the newly collaborative assembly worked through the practical details of their resource-sharing agreement, the hegemony representative sat in his transformed role, sipping questionable alien tea and grudgingly admitting that galactic diplomacy might actually be more effective when it focused on solving problems, rather than demonstrating the creative ways that problems could theoretically be made worse. Outside the crystalline station, the 3 suns continued their eternal dance, casting shifting patterns of light through the chamber where the most powerful beings in the galaxy had accidentally discovered that most cosmic crises could be resolved with proper refreshments and comfortable seating arrangements. The revolution had been so quiet and reasonable that nobody had noticed it happening until it was already complete. The human finished reviewing her notes, closed her tablet with a satisfied click, and smiled at the assembled beings who were still marveling at how efficiently their centuries-old conflict had been resolved through basic project management principles. "Well," she said, raising her cup in a casual toast, "I'd say this calls for a proper celebration. Has anyone tried combining the Aurora moss infusion with the wing membrane tea? I suspect the mineral content would complement the bioluminescent properties quite nicely." And thus did the galaxy discover that its most intractable problems had been waiting patiently for someone brave enough to sit down and ask for proper refreshments. The aftermath of what would become known as the Great Sitting Revolution rippled across the spiral arm with the inexorable force of a cosmic bureaucratic reform. Within hours of the treaty signing, news of the unprecedented diplomatic breakthrough had reached 17 different news networks, 43 academic institutions, and one particularly gossipy trade route that specialized in spreading scandalous information about government efficiency improvements. The human delegate, seemingly oblivious to the historical significance of her refreshment-based diplomatic strategy, had begun organizing what she cheerfully called a proper implementation committee. This involved assigning various species to different aspects of the mining operation based on their natural advantages, a concept so radically sensible that several political science professors experienced minor nervous breakdowns trying to incorporate it into existing theoretical frameworks. The Zephyrians, it turned out, were exceptional at aerial surveying and quality control monitoring. The Molten Collective's natural heat resistance made them ideal for deep core extraction operations. The Sedimentarians, with their geological expertise and infinite patience, were perfect for long-term structural planning and environmental impact assessment. The discovery that species might actually be good at different things, rather than simply competing for dominance, struck the assembly as both revolutionary and embarrassingly obvious. "You know," the human mused, consulting her tablet while accepting a fourth experimental beverage from an enthusiastic kitchen staff member, "this collaborative approach could work for other territorial disputes as well. Most resource conflicts seem to stem from the assumption that there's only one way to utilize available materials." The hegemony representative, who had spent the last century perfecting his intimidation techniques, found himself inadvertently becoming the galaxy's first collaborative conflict resolution administrator. His natural organizational skills, previously devoted to scheduling vaporizations and maintaining fear-based compliance, proved remarkably transferable to coordinating multi-species industrial partnerships. "Perhaps," he admitted reluctantly, settling more comfortably into his new sitting position, "efficiency has been somewhat overlooked in traditional diplomatic approaches." The human smiled with the satisfied expression of someone whose workday was proceeding exactly as planned, completely unaware that she had accidentally invented a new form of interstellar civilization based on the radical principles of comfort, communication, and properly prepared beverages. 3 hours later, as the newly formed interspecies mining cooperative finalized their operational protocols, something unprecedented occurred in the chamber's millennia-long history: spontaneous laughter. It began when one of the sedimentarian representatives made a geological pun so terrible that even rocks would have groaned, and spread through the assembly like a beneficial contagion. The Zephyrin's musical laughter harmonized with the Molten Collective's bubbling chuckles, while the hegemony representative discovered that his intimidating vocal apparatus was surprisingly well suited to producing amused rumbling sounds. The human, who had been quietly reviewing the final contract terms, looked up to find 47 different species engaged in what could only be described as having a good time. The sight of beings who had arrived prepared for cosmic domination now sharing terrible jokes while sampling experimental tea blends struck her as perfectly normal, which perhaps explained everything about how humans had managed to survive their own evolutionary process. "Well," she said, closing her briefcase with the decisive click of someone whose impossible job was somehow complete, "I think we can call this a successful diplomatic outcome. Same time next week for the follow-up meeting? I'll bring proper tea."